For this lecture, I want to talk about two topics that are definitely related. Most of this content is going to be found in Chapter 16 of Unit 4.2, but some of this has already been sprinkled in throughout Chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. What I want to talk about today is antebellum slavery, the institution of slavery in the American South before the Civil War, and then closely connected to that, abolition and the movement, the anti-slavery movement against antebellum slavery. On our unit page, I'll just show you some of the things that we're going to look at. The PowerPoint that I'm going to show you is just that textbook PowerPoint, and it's located down here. I'm not going to click on it because I've already got it open, but if you want to get to this PowerPoint, you can click there for Chapter 16. And then at the end, I'm going to come back and we're going to look at this link, quotes on abolition and slavery. So first off, antebellum slavery. Of course, that phrase, antebellum, means pre-war. And one of the things that we need to conceptualize is, what did slavery look like in America in the 1800s? And what I've seen a lot in the AP curriculum is, how does that compare to, say, colonial slavery? So we've already studied the origins of slavery in America with the Middle Passage and the changes over time after Bacon's Rebellion and the emphasis on cash crop agriculture like tobacco and rice and indigo. But what's changing by the time you get into the 1800s? Here's a few differences for antebellum slavery. One thing to note is, by this point, most slaveholders are increasing their slave population through natural reproduction. Yes, there's still buying and selling of slaves. There's auctioning going on, and we'll come back to that more in a minute. But the idea of the Middle Passage, or importing slaves from Africa, will largely end in the early 1800s. Now, we do need to clarify that I'm sure smuggling and illegal trading of slaves still did happen. But in terms of our Constitution and law, the importation of slaves was banned in 1809. So when you get into the 1800s, the slave population is largely increasing through natural reproduction. That is between the slaves themselves, but that's also a lot of times through rape or other exploits between owners and their slaves procreating. So the slave population is naturally reproducing. Antebellum slavery is also going to be larger than colonial slavery. We're going to see many more slaves. By the time we get to the Civil War, the common number that you'll see by 1860 is that there are going to be at least 4 million slaves in the United States. Now, that there are also free blacks, and I've seen anywhere from 250 to 500,000 free blacks in the South and in the North. So not every black person in the United States was a slave, but slavery had increased up to about 4 million, or at least 4 million, by the time the American Civil War will begin. Another big difference between colonial slavery and antebellum slavery is what slaves are working on. Cotton. And in Chapter 14, the cotton gin was mentioned. And many of the founding fathers thought that slavery, as they knew it, related to tobacco and other cash crops, would eventually die out as America became more industrialized in manufacturing. Of course, the cotton gin changed that. It made it extremely profitable to harvest and reap a lot of cotton quickly in the South, and that perpetuated slavery in the 1800s. On the big plantations, there was also a whole variety of jobs associated with having hundreds of slaves, household duties, cooks, people to do laundry and other things like that. Now, this graph that I have up here from that PowerPoint shows you that the majority of slaves were concentrated in the hands of a few. So this idea of the big southern plantation with the big house and hundreds of slaves. It did happen, and tons, but there are far larger numbers that either owned very few slaves or owned no slaves at all. These maps down here, let's see if I can pull these up, show huge chunks of land. Let's go to this one. Where there are no slaves or very little slave owning in the South. You can see it's very densely concentrated in areas of Virginia and especially South Carolina. And this was 1820, and then it spread out more by 1860. So you can see it has grown there. So differences between colonial slavery, natural reproduction in the antebellum period, larger in the antebellum period, an emphasis on cotton, what eventually will come to be known as king cotton. And then a final difference, antebellum slavery is going to be harsher. And this is in terms of the violent treatment of African Americans, but also in just the nature of bondage in terms of the workday, the devaluing of personhood, and in some senses the hopelessness. A general rule is the deeper you go into the South, the harsher the treatment of slaves. One famous threat of slave owners who were in more the top part of the South was the threat of breaking families apart and being sold further south. Sometimes they said being sold down the Mississippi or sold down the river. The idea that slave families would be broken apart, maybe the father would be shipped off. This idea of separation of families and harsher treatment in the South is a characteristic of antebellum slavery. At the same time, you don't want to fall into the misconception or the trap that every single slave situation was the same. Not every slave was beaten or whipped, and that's not a justification or an excuse, but it's another form of oppression. Actually, many slave owners took a paternalistic aspect to their slaves. And because of racism, they viewed slaves as somebody who needed to be controlled, cared for. And while that didn't include harsh beatings, that paternal aspect was a nature of antebellum slavery. And finally, the only other thing I would really emphasize as far as the characteristics of antebellum slavery is the importance for slaves of religion and family. When families were able to stay together, those were slaves' closest confidants. Oftentimes, if the father or the husband was sold away, mothers took a strong role in African American families. Slave families. Religion played an important part. Many slaves were not taught to read. If they were, sometimes it was so they could read the Bible. So there was usually a blend of Christian metaphors with other slave religious beliefs. So for example, the story of Exodus and the Israelites being liberated out of slavery to the Egyptians, seeking the promised land, is a metaphor from religious scriptures that became very important to slave culture and slave identity. At the same time, slave owners would use biblical passages from Genesis and in some of the New Testament letters to tell slaves to obey their masters. And in that case, slaves would reject those aspects of religion and Christianity, but embrace the others. So the importance of family and religion to a unique slave culture is definitely something we need to know about antebellum slavery. Okay. At this point, I kind of want to shift and talk a little bit about abolition. One of the coolest things to come out of the antebellum period is the growing voice of whites and blacks against against the institution of slavery. If you scroll on through this PowerPoint, and I'm not going to go through it all, but there is some things further down. Let me see if I can zoom out here. This is a little bit about life under the lash, burdens. Here we go. Early abolition. We talked about this in the last lecture. A lot of abolitionism was inspired by the Second Great Awakening. There's some stuff here on Theodore Weld, who's important. I'm going to talk about Garrison. Here you go. David Walker. He is a black abolitionist. He is a radical who advocates a bloody end to supremacy, to white supremacy. Frederick Douglass is the most famous black abolitionist. I think it's important. Sometimes when we talk about abolitionism, we see it as northern whites liberating slaves. And while that's a part of it, the truth is some of the greatest abolitionists were the slaves themselves or people of color who had already escaped from bondage. So definitely know David Walker and Frederick Douglass. There's a few other things in here in terms of slave revolts. Here's where I want to shift now, though. I want to come back and I want to look at these quotes on abolition and slavery. One of the misconceptions that we really have to dispel in an AP class is the overgeneralization that the South liked slavery and the North was against slavery. As far as overgeneralizations go, that's not untrue. That is a general way to say it. But at an AP and at a historical level, we need to dig into some of the nuance a little bit. Here's another way to say this, and this will come up in these quotes. Abolition and anti-slavery are not the same thing. Sometimes, if we're just talking off the cuff, maybe even in a lecture like this, if we're just not being careful, we might use those words interchangeably. Well, he was an anti-slavery advocate, or he was an abolitionist. Well, if we dig into the words, there is a unique difference. So one of the activities we'll do in class is we will pull these up, and I'll let students read through these documents, and I'll encourage each student to take notes on the subtle differences between here, William Lloyd Garrison's perspective. Here, the Republican Party perspective from 1860. This is probably closely related to Abraham Lincoln. And then the American Colonization Society, this little excerpt. For example, William Lloyd Garrison is what we are going to call an abolitionist. He believed that slavery was morally wrong and it needed to be abolished. The institution needed to be destroyed. One of his famous mantras was that slavery should be immediate and uncompensated, meaning that it needs to be done right now, and slave owners should not be paid for the loss of their slaves, uncompensated. He said that slavery was an abomination to God, and it made even our Constitution, which sanctioned slavery, a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. If you read through this, you can see his hatred of slavery. Now, he's coming from a religious perspective, and this is a white abolitionist. But certainly people like David Walker and Frederick Douglass would agree that slavery is a moral wrong that needed to be immediately abolished. Okay, so that's one perspective. However, many people in the North would not categorize themselves as abolitionists, but they would say they're anti-slavery. In this case, they're saying slavery is wrong. It's not preferred. They might even say it's not right. However, it is legal. It is protected by our Constitution. That the way our Constitution was written up, states have the right to place the legal parameters around slavery. And according to our Constitution and Southern law, slaves are property. And so you can't just take somebody's property or without compensation or without changing the Constitution. One of the things the Republican Party by 1860 was saying was with their anti-slavery stance was just don't allow slavery to expand. We can't outlaw existing slavery, but as a country, we could prevent future slavery in future areas. So the Republican Party took the anti-slavery stance that said slavery shouldn't expand. This is kind of ambiguous when it comes to morality. It's not necessarily saying that slavery is morally wrong. It's just saying it is legally allowed and maybe can legally be prevented in the future in other areas. One group that was really on board with this "don't allow slavery to expand" strategy was a third political party called the Free Soilers. The Free Soilers did not want to see slavery expand, not because of a great compassion for slaves or Black people, but because they wanted white people to have less competition and better job opportunities in the West as we moved west. So that's a nuance where somebody could be anti-slavery without necessarily being pro-Black, an abolitionist, or see slavery as a moral wrong. Same thing with colonization. This is a middle of the road approach that said that slavery is a problem and it's a dividing point in our country, but they didn't really see abolition as a feasible solution. And so what they advocate was paying Southern slave owners, compensating slaves to free their slaves, but then relocating African slaves back to Africa. This was called the colonization movement. This is a very racist viewpoint. It holds the idea that whites and Blacks cannot coexist in an equal standing. They acknowledge that slavery is divisive, but they don't acknowledge equality. And instead, they push for separation through colonization. In fact, in the 1820s, America helps to found a colony in Africa, in Liberia. And the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named after U.S. President James Monroe. And many politicians, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, they espouse variations of these two views as anti-slavery while not being abolitionists. Finally, this is not a view of abolition. This is, in fact, the exact opposite. Many Southerners, this excerpt is by a guy named George Fitzhugh. I think for homework, I have you look at a speech by Thomas Hammond, and also famous Senator John C. Calhoun also espoused these ideas. This Southern perspective is certainly the white, racist majority perspective of antebellum slavery. They said not only should slavery not be abolished, they said not only should slavery not be held in check, but that it should be allowed to expand because they said slavery was a positive good. This is no doubt America at our worst, but we do need to pick through some of the arguments because while these are justifications of slavery, which we would reject, they do introduce interesting class arguments and questions about class and the role of government in society. In general, what the positive good theory said was in the paternalistic South, while slaves were seen as inferior and enslaved, they were at least taken care of with housing, clothing, food, family, things like that. Of course, we can point through and talk about how poorly all of those things were actually executed. But that's what many Southern slave owners said, look, I feed, I house, I clothe, I educate, I take care of my slaves in a paternalistic manner. However, in the North, you're going to have a lower class, typically of immigrants and lower class whites that are the foundation of Northern society, and they are in the streets, they are homeless, they are criminals, and the North, in the capitalist sense, does not take care of their lowest class of citizens, whereas in the South, they're arguing paternalistically that they do. While, in no sense does the positive good theory justify slavery, we do need to think through those questions of how do we, in terms of the class pyramid of the social structure, how do people at the top, people at the middle, account for and address and respect and take care of people at the bottom? And do we allow for ways of upward mobility? So those are interesting. Or do we believe that upward mobility is a possibility, and how do we ensure that opportunity? Okay, that's it for this antebellum slavery and 4 different views of slavery in the antebellum period. For all my virtual learners, I hope this was helpful, and check out more details about each of these in chapter 16. Thanks.